That's truly extraordinary. And I even wrote down what the memo said to remind myself. So this was a memo that the Pentagon sent out to reporters to renew or obtain a press pass to report in the Pentagon. And it said they could only publish information, quote, approved for public release by an appropriate authorizing official, even if it is unclassified. And that really is unprecedented.
Hi guys, how are you?
Hi, Katrina.
I think that I think
Hey.
this is my first time ever to do this podcast in the rain, in my raincoat.
You know what? You know what's funny is last year I did the podcast in that exact position, and it was also raining. It's something that the UN General Assembly has against our podcast, I swear.
Yeah, yeah. You know what? It's been beautiful the last few days, but just today the heavens have opened, as we say, and it's raining a lot. So I'm here in my like fisherman rain jacket, huddled under an umbrella, hoping that enough rain stays off my equipment here to get to the end of the podcast without it all frying. But yeah, here we are. Anyway, I'm at the United Nations General Assembly, just for anyone who doesn't recognize all the flags behind me there, where we've been all week listening to world leaders, including President Trump, and all of them exercising their right to free speech and freedom of expression, and saying what they want to say about the state of the world as they see it, because that debate has been raging here yet again, hasn't it? We saw Jimmy Kimmel back on air, and he had quite a pop at the president and the FCC chair.
Yeah, I think we were all sort of waiting with bated breath once we heard that Disney had reinstated the show about how he was going to handle this. Was he going to, just make a joke? Was he going to just brush it off completely? But I think, he went into a 20-minute monologue trying to make the issue of free speech a bipartisan issue. He called it un-American. He was contrite about offending Kirk's family and supporters. He gave a very tearful speech about how he was moved by Erica Kirk comments during the memorial service. And it seemed to, we weren't the only ones paying attention because 6.3 million viewers tuned in, even though, the two media conglomerates who initially had said they were going to boycott the show said they would continue to boycott the show, but people found a way to watch.
I was in Europe the last few weeks, and I was fascinated by how many people were following Jimmy Kimmel's suspension from his show there, and how late night comedy hosts where was in Germany were picking up on that and kind of carrying the flag for what they say is important free speech in the US. And, if you think about it, free speech really is the ultimate right in the US, right? It's the First Amendment, and it is the right from which all other rights really come in the US, and it's such a prized or really crown jewel of democracy here. And if you think about how we've seen the Trump administration criticize the UK, for example, or other European countries for what they say is censorship of free speech, they point to this absolute right that you have in the US to express yourself, and for the press, for example, to report as well. And at the same time, just because Jimmy Kimmel's show is back on air doesn't, I mean, this debate is far from over, isn't it? I mean, we really have been seeing these massive discussions about what does it mean to be able to protect speech that you don't like, but that is still admissible under the Constitution in the US. And, a lot of President Trump's critics have said, as we all know, that we have seen the Trump administration, after promising to protect free speech, literally day one coming to office, signing executive order saying we're restoring free speech, instead have tried to roll back rights on speech that they don't like. And I think this is really going to underline a lot of the friction that we see between President Trump and his critics going forward.
It's interesting you mentioned Germany, Sumi, because Jimmy Kimmel actually gave a shout out to talk show hosts in Germany and in my own Ireland for having made contact with him when he said one of the Germans offered him a job to go if
Yeah.
he hadn't been put back on air for ABC. But what I've thought was really interesting is how some of those conservative big names have been coming out in defense of Jimmy Kimmel as well. I mean, we famously heard from Senator Ted Cruz saying that this was the wrong thing to have done, and it was he who compared Brendan Carr, the FCC chair, the regulator, first to a mob boss. And also we had Joe Rogan on his podcast using that same expression of, this is un-American, and saying to, the conservatives who follow him, of which there are millions, don't cheer for this, don't celebrate this. If you're calling for this, you're setting up the situation where the other side, as he puts it, will do the same to us should there be a Democrat in power in the future, that you're just setting up this really dangerous precedent.
When you lose Joe Rogan, you're in trouble, right? But one thing I do want to mention, I think is important, is that the First Amendment doesn't protect people seeking out private corporations from reprimanding employees, right? So it wasn't a matter of Jimmy Kimmel, his free speech wasn't being protected by Disney revoking it. It was the intimidation tactics, right, that we saw from Brendan Carr, and we continue to see from the president, who came out right before the show on Truth Social and said,
Sorry, my colleagues are protecting me from the rain here, Courtney. Sorry for interrupting, but just if anyone's wondering what these hands are appearing behind me. Thank you.
No, the fisherman's jacket
I know,
is
it's
perfect.
just, protect the hair. I've still got many, many hours of television to do after this. Sorry, I'm so rude. Please carry on.
No, of course. But just to put a fine point on it, it's the intimidation tactics by the administration, right? This job owning. This certainly seems to be a win for free speech advocates, but this continues to be a strategy by this White House to try and wield influence over some of these private companies through government.
Well, and if you look at the fact that free speech advocates are pointing to not just the suspension of Jimmy Kimmel's show, they see what they call a pattern of restriction of free speech rights by the Trump administration. They point to the fact that you saw students, for example, who were protesting the war in Gaza, detained and with the threat of deportation. So remember the student Rumeza Öztürk, who's a student at Tufts University. In the end, she was released from prison because the judge in that case said, you have to show me some proof that this student is a threat, to national security here in the U.S., that she's supporting a terrorist organization. What it looks like is she's exercising her free speech right. And in the end, she has been released. Her case is still pending for whether she's deported or not. But, they have also pointed to the fact that the president and his administration have threatened to rescind funds to schools and universities that have DEI policies, which we've talked a lot about on this program, obviously. And, the argument there is that these policies being exercised by these institutions are part of free speech. They point to law firms that have been threatened and cowed into submission, as they put it, in their words, for having taken part in prosecutions of President Trump and his allies. And in the body of all of that, what these free speech advocates are saying is that this has, the term that's always used, the chilling effect, right, of preventing speech before it is even expressed. And that is a really dangerous precedent. And that's something we do have to watch really closely going forward. And I want to say the Trump administration says this is nothing to do with free speech. This is about, threats to national security or dangerous policies and so on and so forth.
And in the case of Jimmy Kimmel, President Trump has said it's because he's just bad at his job and low rating, hasn't he? And we do have to remember Stephen Colbert's show has been pulled from CBS as well at the end of this season, but we'll wait to see whether there's any change there. I'm just wondering, what extent do you guys think the reversal of the decision by ABC had to do with what we're told were sizable numbers of people who cancelled their subscriptions to Disney Plus and Hulu? And was it, a kind of financial decision, perhaps, in a way, to put him back on air? That because he made a joke, didn't he? I've been given this statement to read out by our parent company, and it was kind of like, you should go to your homepage and click on blah, blah, blah to reactivate your subscription.
Yeah, I mean, you did see a lot of backlash, both from the wider public, people coming out and saying they're canceling their subscriptions, as you said, Katrina, but also from celebrities who signed more than 400 celebrities and actors signed a letter denouncing it and, raising the alarm about the implications of this decision. And you also saw the former head of Disney, Michael Eisner, who has, notably been not in the wing and political realm, come out and say, "Where's the leadership?" Which is a message that seemed to get to Bob Iger, the current CEO of Disney. So I do think it certainly played a part in maybe some of those discussions they had with Jimmy Kimmel, as they said they had been having over the past couple of days.
Yeah, all the analysts I've been speaking to on our programs throughout this week have said to me, look, the pressure in itself from so many of Jimmy Kimmel's advocates, but also on Disney itself as a company. You had singers pulling out of a big festival that Disney was a sponsor of, and other celebrities kind of threatening to do the same. That really could have had a lasting impact on Disney, but also the public and social pressure in support of Jimmy Kimmel. And the fact that you do, as you said earlier, Katrina, some Republicans saying, this really is un-American. You can't have this kind of censorship. So all of that led to his reinstatement. But look, President Trump, we've seen on True Social, he's doubled down on the fact that Jimmy Kimmel was suspended. And he said, the other hosts that are terrible, Jimmy Fallon on NBC News, Seth Meyers, NBC, excuse me, they should be next. And he said, in a really telling, let's say, interaction with reporters on Air Force One, these networks are essentially reporting 97% bad news on me. Their licenses should be looked at. And I think the big point that we have to keep in mind here is a lot of what we're seeing in terms of the questioning of the licenses for big broadcast networks and Jimmy Kimmel's suspension, a lot of it from most of the constitutional scholars who've been speaking up and legal scholars, they say this would not hold up in court. I mean, you had the Supreme Court in 2024 ruled that the state of New York's efforts to punish companies that did business with the NRA, so the National Rifle Association, because of the organization's its political positions, that violated First Amendment rights. And I mean, it's a bit convoluted, but it's important to know that was a unanimous Supreme Court decision. That sets a very clear precedent for any case that would land in front of the Supreme Court on First Amendment rights, or at least it appears to be, that the Supreme Court would rule in favor of the groups that are complaining that their rights are being violated.
Courtney, do you see a thread between this and what we've seen happen with the White House press corps? We saw AP being essentially punished or their access restricted because they wouldn't call the Gulf of America, they called it the Gulf of Mexico. We saw the Wall Street Journal, I think it was, not let on a plane for one of the out-of-town trips because it had published that story about the birthday book with Epstein and so on. That there is kind of an effort there to control what the news media is doing and saying about this administration.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think this is a pervasive strategy by this White House to try and control, what the media narrative is there, right? And I think there's I know that there is great frustration within the press corps. Even late last week, we saw the Pentagon come out and say they are asking reporters to, basically asking journalists not to do journalism, right? So they've gone a step further than this White House even. We are seeing some media organizations push back a little bit. We saw the Wall Street Journal come out and challenge the lawsuit that the defamation suit the president filed against them for their Epstein reporting, and saying that this was a violation of free speech.
And I just want to highlight that again with the Pentagon, because that's truly extraordinary. And I even wrote down what the memo said to remind myself. So this was a memo that the Pentagon sent out to reporters to renew or obtain a press pass to report in the Pentagon. And it said they could only publish information, quote, approved for public release by an appropriate authorizing official before it is released, even if it is unclassified. And that really is unprecedented. And I mean, to your point, Courtney, we are seeing a number of organizations say they are readying for a fight. I think it's important to remember as well that if you look at how the vice president, J.D. Vance, or Stephen Miller, for example, and many of President Trump's allies have justified much of what we're seeing in terms of a crackdown on free speech, as free speech advocates say, are describing it. They say that that was exactly what they were a victim of during the Biden administration. They point to, for example, the social media companies during the COVID pandemic restricting speech that they saw as mis or disinformation on COVID, on vaccines. And many conservatives see that as a blatant violation of free speech. And they point to the 4 criminal cases that Donald Trump faced and say, look, you talk about lawfare, that was lawfare that President Trump faced these cases. And in a way, they see this as a bit of a corrective. But, free speech advocates, as we've been saying, see it instead as a really dangerous step in the wrong direction.
Well, Twitter actually even kicked Donald Trump off, didn't they, in the wake of
Yep.
the January 6th riots, attacks, incursions on Capitol Hill. So, there is a precedent there, I guess, but the country has moved to a different place right now. But Courtney, you mentioned there, how this administration deals with political opponents. And we had that dramatic development in a way, but also signposted development in another way with this news that James Comey, the former FBI director, is going to be indicted by the federal prosecutors in the state of Virginia. That comes in the wake of that post from President Trump on Truth Social last weekend, calling on his Attorney General, Pam Bondi, to basically do just this against James Comey and against some others. So, to your point, Sumi, about this weaponization, this lawfare of the Department of Justice that this administration say they were victims of, it seems to be, on the face of it, as we know right now, that that's exactly what they're doing.
Yeah, as you mentioned, Katrina, that case in the Eastern District of Virginia, the federal prosecutor there resigned under pressure after that post by the president. He declined to charge Comey. There's reporting that he told colleagues he had insufficient evidence. But the president has quickly appointed one of his special assistants, Lindsay Halligan, a former defense lawyer who does not have prosecution experience, to that post. And she is now deciding, again, it's about, there's seemingly no sort of independence, or that veneer of independence has been eroded. And he is wielding his reach across the government to go after, some of his perceived political opponents, and how he does it. He's been not so, he's being a lot more blatant, I suppose, than he had been in the past.
And we should say, it's not necessarily only action, but even the threat of it. And that's something we've seen President Trump wield quite a bit on his Truth Social platform. In fact, he's talked about going after Senator Adam Schiff of California, someone who we know, of course, that the president is not fond of, and who has been very critical of President Trump. And he's under federal investigation at the moment for mortgage fraud. That's something we've also seen President Trump direct towards, or his administration direct towards, the Federal Reserve and the governor, Lisa Cook there, who he wants removed from that post because of the Federal Reserve's monetary policy. And, the president wants to see rates lowered. And for, just that threat alone, of course, you have to think about the effect that has. And also the fact that, you can say that in court, some of these cases may not hold up, or that President Trump's case might not actually be successful, but it is the process to getting there. The lawyers, the preparation for these cases that can in itself prevent perhaps some of the speech that we're talking about, or really have an impact on how some of President Trump's political opponents see him and their kind of position in opposing him.
President Trump was asked actually about that Comey indictment earlier on Thursday, and he said he doesn't know what's going to happen with James Comey, but he then went on to say, and this is a quote, "I can only say that Comey is a bad person. He's a sick person. I think he's a sick guy. He did terrible things at the FBI." So to your point, Sumi, if you're, a younger person at any of these agencies, you're going to be thinking, do I want to stay on in this job if potentially my name is out there and the president of our country is going to say these things about me? Should I make a decision that he doesn't like? It takes a lot of bravery and courage to put yourself and your family out there in that way.
I mean, what I wonder, and I guess it's a question to both of you, is how all of this will affect a political debate and dialogue as we get into, well, we're now reaching October. We're going to be about a year away from the midterm elections. We're about a year past the November 2024 election. And, Democrats are in a way, little by little, finding their feet and finding their strategies. But how will all of this effort by the Trump administration on speech, on some of the legal cases that we mentioned, what impact will do you think it'll have on political dialogue and
Well, I
debate?
think on the panels that we've been having on our shows this last week or two is a good indicator, because I have felt that the viewpoints are getting even more polarized. Like before, people would be able to find some agreement, but on these issues, some of our contributors that like they are in disagreement. Everyone agrees that political violence, violent rhetoric, etc., should be stamped out, no question there. But in terms of where that sort of free speech or powers of the government can get to. But, if you're, firstly, don't rush the year away just by saying it's nearly a year to the midterms, because
Sorry.
we need to catch our breath. But what I think is going to be fascinating is, President Trump has said, let's hold a convention before the midterms. Like
Yeah.
that, if you're talking about speech and control of the airwaves and the messaging, it's kind of a political genius move in a way, because you get to have President Trump, who isn't on the ballot in the midterms unless he decides to run for Congress, a seat in the House or a Senate seat. But you get him on the campaign trail. You get to hold a big, huge event like we saw last year, running into the presidential election. And it's quite a clever move, I think.
Yeah, and just one thing to add, I've been talking to some Democrats about this, and it comes at a really tricky point for them, right? Because they have floundered in finding the unifying message. They're kind of without, a real concrete party leader right now. But the blowback around Kimmel has been interesting because it gives them something to rally behind beyond just Trump being a threat to democracy, right? Point to the contradictions in the Republican Party about free speech. But it also is a way for them to connect the dots for people on what they see as the president being a threat to democracy and free speech, right? You're losing your favorite late night comedian. This is like a very real world consequence for people who aren't necessarily paying attention to politics. So, some see it as a means of changing the narrative around cancel culture, which obviously was previously attributed to policing right wing speech that we talked about. But I think there's real division on how much to capitalize on this ahead of next year, because as you guys know, we saw in the presidential focusing on, a threat to democracy really was not something that landed well with voters. And there's real concern that they'll people in the party will glob onto this and lose, the sight of the bigger message that they need to find in order to win back uh, seats in Congress.
Well, I hate to curtail our free speech, but I think we're actually out of time. Uh, but Katrina,
I
we got to let you
know.
go as well, so maybe you can
Yes.
get dry somehow. I don't know
I'm
how,
like a
but
little duck here sitting in the middle of my Thank you to my colleagues for rigging up. You can't really see it in this angle, but I've got a Mary Poppins globe of umbrellas around me at the moment, which is very kind. But yes, lots more to chat about. I'll see you guys in a more warm and dry location, hopefully next week. Bye.
see you then.
See you guys.
If you enjoyed this episode of The President's Path, then do like and subscribe to our YouTube channel, and we would love to hear from you. So please leave us a comment below or email us on path@bbc.co.uk.